Hi everyone and welcome back. We are joined today by Clare Daly and Mick Wallace, two former members of the EU Parliament from Ireland, to discuss what's been changing with the European Union. So welcome to the both of you. It's good to see you again.
Thanks very much, Glenn. Always good to see you.
Thank you.
So the European Union, from my perspective, is almost unrecognizable now after only a few years. Again, the original idea of the European Union was to promote economic ties between the European states, to create more benign political relations and overcome the wars of the past. But these days, the old economic logic of the bloc doesn't seem to be working. The EU has made itself complicit in genocide. It's now boycotting diplomacy with Russia for about 3 years, and instead the only game in town is more sanctions and more weapons, even if we're losing the war. Dissent is crushed under the guise of combating disinformation and propaganda, and much of this seemed to have occurred under the EU's argument that it's asserting itself as a geopolitical power. Yet, as the EU claims this is the source of its relevance, it's actually losing its strength, economic, political, moral relevance in the world, and in many parts of the world it's even becoming a bit of a joke. It didn't used to be like this, again, until recently. I was wondering, how do you explain this huge transformation in a relatively short period of time?
Well, I would say that the transformation is not as dramatic as you seem to think. We would say that the EU project was a bit like this for a long time. Only, I suppose, the mask has slipped in the last few years. Look, at the same as NATO was created in '49, not to protect Europe, but it was designed to make sure that Europe stayed in step with the interest of U.S. empire. And when the EU was formed, it was also a case of sort of rounding up the countries and get them all into one pool, a bit of a United States to Europe in a form. And it was going to be easier for the Americans to manage it. Now, normally, if America goes to somewhere like Syria, they try to break it up in order to manage it. But in Europe, I think they wanted to get all the states into one basket, and so that they were all singing off the one hymn sheet, and one that was strongly aligned with the interests of U.S. empire. And that has been the case for a long time. I mean, back as far as, I mean, you're referring to the last couple of years, mostly under the supervision of von der Leyen, who has obviously been a very negative force from our perspective. But I remind you, as far back as 2012, 2013, the EU got involved in a mission in Mali and the Sahel. And it was all about imperialism and neocolonialism, right? And we were spending money back then even. And now obviously the French were more directly involved, but that whole project was nuts. And we were spending a whole lot of money on it. So Europe hasn't changed its spots that much of late. This has been going on for a while. And I suppose first for us, and you as well, as we're well aware of, the Ukraine war was a real wake-up call, despite the fact that it wasn't quite so much a wake-up call for the average person in Europe, because the media have done a very good job of managing the narrative on Ukraine. It's probably not quite as much today, but even still today, you'd be a bit shocked at the amount of people that still believe the narrative that Ukraine is fighting for our democracy, which we know it isn't. Ukraine is fighting for NATO, it's fighting for Western imperialism, and they're in self-destruct mode, but that's a different issue, right? But I suppose Gaza, more than anything ever, has exposed them for really who they are, given that they have supported the genocide 100%. There hasn't been a bad word said to Israel. There's been nothing done. And what we had, you might have seen there from the EU, some EU individuals in the last couple of weeks. Oh my God, it's terrible that people are starving in Gaza. Oh, the food should be let in. The food should be let in. Oh yeah, it should, yeah. But I mean, why were you giving them bombs to destroy them for so many months up to now? I mean, we've had a whole lot of liberals coming out saying, oh, this is not good enough, because they're actually starting to read the message that the people are absolutely shocked at what they're witnessing in Gaza. And the EU has been behind the curve, as they have supported the Zionist project from the start. And that wasn't quite so obvious a few years back, but that's actually been the case for a long time. But now they're actually, we have these fellas now coming out saying, oh my God, maybe we shouldn't be starving them. But we'll continue to give them bombs, and we'll continue to destroy their homes. We'll continue to make sure that nobody can live in the place when we're done. And I suppose that's the EU that you were talking about, that has been seen to be exposed and to be seen, oh my God, is this the EU that was the supposed peace project after the Second World War? Is this the EU that was about an economic union? And now it's more about geopolitics, promoting the interests of US empire. I mean, we stopped buying Russian gas and paid multiples more for LNG, which is filthy, and huge emissions from the gas on the shipping coming across 5,000 kilometers. And we're saying, oh, this is a good idea. And we had von der Leyen telling us that this is cheaper, when it is a total lie. Anyway, I better stop telling here.
No, I mean, I think both of you are right, actually. I mean, I think Mick is right in that what we see now is the masks slipping. And everything you described at the start, Glenn, is utterly shocking in the context of the propaganda that the EU has splurged out since its foundation, that it was a coming together of countries to further their economic interests, that it was, as Mick said, a peace project after World War II. And that when they did morph into the sort of geopolitical end, well, we don't have interests, we have values. And when we go elsewhere, we go with our values. And in fairness, we've been lucky in our parliamentary positions to be able to travel to many countries. And it is true that countries which were colonized by Europe, and we know the devastation that was done there, that many of the people in those countries would say, well, at least the Europeans left something. The Americans are now plundering and murdering and occupying and all of that, and we get nothing back. Yes, it was terrible with the Europeans, but they did leave something, and there were some benefits, and they did even then look favourably on Europe. But all that's gone now, primarily because of Gaza. But Mick is right. The roots of that are not in the last few years. You have to see the European project as a sort of a salami, slice by slice movement towards what they hoped would be a United States of Europe. That is not something that I believe will ever happen. But people outside of the European Union and outside of Europe, particularly in the US, would look to somebody like von der Leyen and think that she's like Trump. But anybody who lives in Europe knows that she's irrelevant. She's an unelected bureaucrat at the head of the European Commission. So they never got their way on that. But through the Lisbon Treaty and through adopting a sort of a a legal role in foreign affairs through the creation of the position of the High Representative, for example, so they would have a common foreign policy. It was never supposed to be like that. That's the direction, and it's from that taking of power from national states into the European bubble that we've now got to the situation where we are now complicit in genocide and doing everything we can to keep the war in Ukraine going to the detriment of the people living there, even though we're supposed to be their biggest friends, allegedly.
I like that phrase, dropping of the liberal veil, because a lot of the policies have been quite consistent, I guess, but dressing it up in liberal values, I think this is one key thing which has begun to fall apart. But yeah, I guess at least in the early 2000s, all the literature about the academic literature about the European Union was about discussions, whether it was a civilian power, normative power, moral power. In other words, academic debate about how great the EU was or why it's so different from everyone else. But yeah, that's why, especially now, what we're seeing in the Middle East is being so, I guess, detrimental to its reputation, at least. And not just Gaza, but in Syria, when the massacres began, and the EU actually went out and, well, began blaming the Alawites for being massacred, for provoking the government, which, under Giuliani. It's quite remarkable, though, that this is still the same EU. But I wanted to ask you, too, about the recognition now of Palestine by the French and the British. Well, they intend to do so in September. Well, so they say. I've read criticism, interestingly enough, in Israeli media, such as Haaretz, where they say that this is just Europeans looking for an excuse to avoid sanctions and wash their hands of the crimes. I was wondering how you interpret this. Is this just symbolic, or is it a step towards a two-state solution, or how are you reading this situation?
Well, the people you're talking about, let's just mention Macron. I mean, these people have lost their credibility already. They have no credibility. It's the kind of, I mean, from the perspective of the majority of people that are, even following the situation, or if you're actually living in West Asia, I mean, this means nothing, right? I mean, as Ali Abonama from the he has a Palestinian website in Canada or America, I'm not sure which, but he said, what's the point of recognizing a state and that you don't even help to exist? And what does it mean? I mean, why don't you stop the genocide? I mean, when Hamas attacked on October 7, 2023, in response to multiple years of persecution and oppression by the Israeli regime with support of the West. The West offered Israel everything they wanted to fight back against Hamas. Now they've spent 22 months now watching a genocide taking place, where Israel are trying to erase the place from the ground. They're trying to erase the people's past, present, and future. We have never, ever, ever witnessed a genocide being recorded before. And even the ones that weren't recorded in the past, most people that have studied these genocides would probably say that this one has probably been worse than the others, which is unthinkable. So, I mean, these guys, they've watched the genocide taking place all these months. And has it ever dawned on them that they should offer the Palestinians some help? Has it ever dawned on them that they would do anything to protect the Palestinians? Did they call on the UN to put in a peacekeeping force to stop the slaughter? Not one EU member state has called for a peace force to be put in to stop Israelis slaughter them. Just the same as not one EU member state has broken off business links with Israel. If you want to stop Israel committing war crimes, stop doing business with them, and shut the fuck up until you actually stop doing business with them, because you're only talking nonsense. As long as you're doing business with them, that's all they care. And they'll do nothing different until you stop doing business with them. The same as South Africa. South Africa didn't change its colours until the world isolated them. They stopped playing rugby with them. They stopped doing business with them. They stopped doing everything with them. And then South Africa said, you know what? We'll have to end this apartheid. Now, obviously, it didn't end completely, and everything's not perfect, but it was a massive change. And but it didn't come about because they became nice fellas overnight. It's because the world community isolated them, and the world community has done zero to isolate Israel. Zero. And if Macron wants to recognize Palestine, in September, or a few of the others as well, and even Starmer, that absolute, oh God, I better not start, right? But what a disappointing individual. But this means nothing. And anyway, the two-state solution is long dead. It will not work. How can you have a Zionist state living beside a Palestinian state and expecting them to leave the Palestinians live in peace? It won't happen. There'll be no peace as long as there's Zionism. And the truth be told, that the only solution going forward is a one-state solution where everybody, be they Muslim, Jewish, Christian, or whatever you like, and whatever you're having yourself, everybody is allowed to live on the land between the river and the sea and live in peace, and human rights for all, equality for all. But obviously, given the regime that we have in Tel Aviv at the moment, and given the behavior of the settlers in the West Bank, obviously we're a long piece away from this. And it will not happen unless the international forces, unless the UN grows a pair of balls and starts functioning like it was supposed to in the first place, and starts doing something productive to stop the atrocities being committed by Israel, monitor the arrangement, and Israel should be isolated by the world. People have to stop doing business with them, or they will not change their colours. But at the moment, we're doing zero. And recognising Palestine in September is a joke, as far as I'm concerned.
I mean, the Irish government recognised Palestine last year to a big fanfare, but it was exactly for the same reasons as you suggested the French and the Brits might be doing it now. It's a pathetic cover for their active complicity in this situation. And even in Ireland, where people say, oh, the Irish government is very good. Well, the Irish government is very good at rhetoric in support of Palestine. But actually, while they've been talking a good talk about Palestinian rights, the Irish Central Bank have been selling Israeli bonds to further the war effort. We have increased our sale of dual-use goods to Israel, and in that sense, we are complicit as well. But the complicity of France, and particularly Britain, who in the last week even it was revealed that their aircraft were involved in refueling Israeli aircraft carriers, which then went on to bomb Gaza, is they are not just enabling genocide. The British are actively involved in this genocide. So recognising a state when it has all but disappeared in the sense of Gaza is actually it's sickening. It's even worse. It's like playing a game with people who are being starved and humiliated already. It's disgusting. And thankfully, the people of France and certainly the people of Britain can see through them, and they have mobilised. It may seem that it's not making a difference, but they have mobilised in their millions and millions to stop this. And I think the very fact that they had to outlaw the likes of Palestine Action in Britain, or take the Irish band kneecap to court for having a flag under the Terrorism Act, shows that they know that they're on shaky ground, that the will of the people is very much with Palestine, and the action of the BDS and sabotage that Palestine Action were involved in can become a beacon. And as Mick said, it's the only way to stop it is isolate them, stop doing business with them, boycott, divest, sanction. That's it. End of. And what Palestine Action were doing was doing that. And I think that's why you see this repression, which you referred to earlier, creeping across Europe now. to silence dissent, to silence the collective right to organise, the right to protest, all of these so-called values that we protect because we support the rule of law and fundamental rights, unlike these authoritarian regimes that are everywhere else. But actually, in this battle that Europe says it's engaged in of authoritarianism versus democracy, the Democrats are becoming a hell of a lot more authoritarian than anyone else, from what I can see.
Glenn, you mentioned about the Liberals there earlier, right? I mean, from our perspective, we see the Liberals as being incredibly complicit in this movement. They were complicit in the Democratic Party in America, where now the Democrats and the Republicans, well, probably since Clinton's time, are probably indistinguishable. But right across Europe now, when we were in the European Parliament, right, we had the so-called S&Ds, we had the Greens, and we had most of our own left group, right? So-called liberals, and half of Renew was deemed to be liberal. In fact, all Renew like to call themselves liberal. I mean, if these are liberals, right? Well, I don't want liberals, right? These guys are a fake, right? These guys pretend that they care about people being treated right, but you know what? They have facilitated the worst that's gone on. Not only have they facilitated the likes of Zionism, not only have they facilitated the atrocities carried out for the last 100 years by U.S. empire, but today they are complicit in facilitating the workings of financial imperialism across the global south. The wreckage that we're still carrying out. I mean, and they are complicit in allowing neoliberalism to gain a foothold in all our European states. Now, people don't want to talk about neoliberalism. And when we used to mention the word neoliberalism in the Irish Parliament, they used to say, oh, God, don't talk about neoliberalism again. Right? They didn't want neoliberalism to be talked about because, as Noam Chomsky said a long time ago, neoliberalism is capitalism with the gloves off. And the atrocities being carried out by these entities with the support of the liberals in Europe is shocking. And I don't need to tell you that probably the biggest supporter of NATO in our 5 years in the European Parliament were the European Greens. My God, the Greens. I mean, it was a break.
There's something very deceptive in general when you have all these leaders saying, well, we're putting all the pressure we can on Netanyahu to take into account humanitarian rights, but while seemingly doing everything besides actually stopping sending the weapons that are killing them. So it is, one gets the impression these are arsonists posing as firefighters. It's very strange to watch. I just want to shift it a bit into our wars here in Europe, though, because for many years the Europeans, they functioned seemingly as a moderating force for the Americans. That is, the Americans always pushing a bit more militarism. The EU was always a bit more cautious. This relationship, when you look at Ukraine, appears to have flipped to some extent, though. That is, the Americans are, they're talking to the Russians, they're discussing possible avenues for peace, while the Europeans are still upholding the boycott of diplomacy, as Kaja Kallas said. Why would we talk to Putin? He's a war criminal, and we don't talk to war criminals. I mean, so essentially giving up on diplomacy. Yeah, well, one can put in some hypocrisy there, of course.
Kaja Kallas is a war criminal.
Yeah. Well, my point is, through all these years, when, for example, the US wanted to expand NATO to Ukraine in 2008, it was the Europeans who pushed back with the argument that this was too provocative for Russia. I think it was Merkel who said this would be interpreted as a declaration of war. But these days, of course, you can't say this. This is Russian propaganda. Now, the same Europeans are saying, well, Russia was never worried about NATO. This is just what it's a Kremlin talking point. So again, that's their own words now they're denouncing. So how do you explain Europe's unwillingness to try to reach an end to this war? Because again, when they talk about peace, they talk about defeating Russia, which is, I guess, peace redefined in a very ugly manner.
I mean, it is quite incredible how far they've come. I mean, when we think back to the first resolution in the parliament after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the one where only 13 of us ended up voting against that resolution. And it's not that we believe that Russia should have invaded Ukraine. We do believe that that was unlawful under international law. It shouldn't have happened. But we understood that Russia were provoked and that this was a NATO proxy war. But we were also particularly voting against the idea that you never send arms into a conflict. That is a no-no. The foundations of, say, the Irish Constitution and certainly the UN is that you always try to resolve these disputes and conflict by peaceful means. And arming that was a no-no. That has become totally normalised now. So the journey that we've gone on from when Europe, as you categorise them, were before seen to be a little bit more nuanced, more into negotiating, into being out and out Russia-phobic, the most ridiculous propaganda, anti-Russian propaganda put out there, which couldn't have got a foothold if it didn't have the power of embellishment by the media, the mainstream media, all across Europe, repeating time after time those lies, like we're Putin puppets, we're Kremlin agents, even though they've never found a word that we ever said in support of Putin. So I think the reason for it is twofold. I think it's an ironic twist of history that at this juncture, we have one of the most incompetent and weakest leadership at European and member state level at this time. But also it's a consequence of a sort of a hijacking by the military-industrial complex and NATO, which has taken place over a period of time, because there had been, and still is in some ways, a bit of a dialogue inside the ranks of the European Union about the prospect, for example, of a European army. And traditionally and ironically, the Brits, when they were involved, because they were such big NATO heads, not because of anything else, were the biggest bulwark against a European army. So the feeling was that once the Brits got out, happy days, the sort of spiraling of a European army then would be able to take off. But that coincided also with, you know, I suppose instead of that happening, what we've had is the European army becoming NATO and Europe being completely subsumed under NATO, which they're kind of scrambling around now. That happened because of Biden after Trump won, after Brexit. They said, oh, we need the Americans. Now they have Trump and they're going, oh my God, we've got to spend more on defense. The Americans are abandoning us, even though, as Mick said, the Americans, the whole tactic of NATO was to divide Europe and keep Russia and Europe apart from each other. So, yeah, I mean, I think they're incompetent. I think they're in hock of the military-industrial complex. And I think it's really unfortunate they've abandoned any role that they could have had for diplomacy, and which, as you said, they actually had a couple of years ago. But now if you say that, you're demonized as a sort of a Russian apologist, a Putin apologist, but actually you're only pointing out really very modern history, which shows you the power of the media, which is why it's so important that we're having chats like this, because the mainstream media are so culpable in the crimes against humanity that we see now.
But this whole issue connects back into the whole notion of democracy. And a wonderful example of it, and we've mentioned this before, right? But twice in the first year of the war, Claire and myself put in an amendment to the Ukraine resolution, and our amendment called on the EU to maximize its potential to commence dialogue and diplomacy with a view to ending the war and establishing peace. And each time, 80% of the MEPs voted against it, 15% were abstaining, and 5% were voting for it. So what you had 5% of over 700 MEPs from all across Europe voting to end the war and bring about peace, and the others no. And yet at the same time, there was a survey only 4 months into the war in June 2022 across Europe, which showed that over 70% at that time of the people of Europe wanted peace rather than continuing to punish Russia, because this was all about punishing Russia. And over 70% of the people, only 4 months into the war, despite all the lies the media were pumping out, wanted peace rather than continue to punish Russia. This became 80% within another 3 months. So while we had 80% of the politicians voting against the war starting, only 5% supporting peace, we have almost the direct opposite in the public. So what you have is you have a political class that do not represent their citizens. Now you might say to yourself, well, how does that happen, given that the citizens vote? Well, okay. I mean, what is voting about? What is democracy about, right? I mean, the role that money and the strength of political parties, the power that they have, and their control over the mainstream media, who are part of the problem, not part of the solution, has a huge impact on who gets into that European Parliament. It has a huge impact on who gets into the national parliaments. And they are not representative of the people anymore. And they have dumbed down politics so much that you have almost half the people in most countries, and less in some countries, not even voting because they don't feel that the political process does anything for them, that it doesn't represent them. And so, and then on top of that, I suppose a big problem, while the established parties will get out their hardcore members to vote, they can carry them to the voting pool if they, polling booth if they have to. They're guaranteed to vote. The poor, who are being treated the worst, are not voting because they think it's a waste of time. And the young people are disillusioned with what they've been watching for a number of years, and they're not voting. And they're the two big segments, because we have a huge proportion of poor people right across Europe. Half the people of Ireland, and we're supposed to be one of the wealthiest countries in the world, half the people of Ireland find it difficult to pay their household bills at the end of the month. And yet we have we have this notion that, oh God, democracy is great. And as Clare said, we love throwing stones at authoritarian regimes. Well, you know what now? We need to have a serious look at what we think is our democracy, because it ain't doing a great job at the moment. If the interests of the citizens are completely sidelined, and we have no say in how our communities are run, how our countries are run, and democracy is where the people have a say in how their community is organized, how their society is organized, how their country functions. That is not happening today.
I'm glad you brought up the quality of the leadership and the state of democracy, because it takes me nicely to my last question, which is about why the leadership, the quality has declined so much. Yanis Varoufakis, he refers frequently to Europe now as the stupid continent, and Kishore Mahbubani, the former president of the UN Security Council, he argues that he recalls the last discussion he had with Henry Kissinger before he died, in which they were discussing the same thing. What is wrong with Europe? And they both came to an agreement that the quality of leadership in Europe was just plummeting, which is a nice way of saying that we're led by idiots, I guess. But now, with this recent EU-US trade agreement, the lack of strategic thinking, it seems like we're governed by emotional sloganeering instead of anything that makes sense. It's again, how do we explain this? You two are the ones who spent your days in the last
We
years.
spent all those 5 years asking ourselves that very same question as well, and we're still kind of asking it, because I think that all of that kind of liberal sloganeering that you've talked about really is just a fig leaf for a kind of a made up identity, and it's a diversion. That's what it is. It's a flipping diversion that is covering the fact that at European level, the leadership have become, I believe, completely and utterly hijacked by lobbyists. I mean, we used to make the point that when we were in Brussels, there were 60,000 officially registered lobbyists in Brussels. So it was becoming a little bit like Capitol Hill. These are the people who have the ears to the politicians in Europe, for example, and they're the ones calling the tune. And then inside that bubble, you had in the member states a very weak leadership who want to be part of that bubble because, when a lot of leaders at national level finish, we had a lot of people in the European Parliament who were former heads of the military service in their country, who were prime ministers, foreign ministers, or whatever, and they get sent into the European Parliament as a sort of a retirement present. And if you get into the Commission, well, even happier. It's a big slush fund where you can go to retire, put your feet up, and get loads of money for doing practically nothing, and for lobbyists telling you that you're absolutely brilliant. So I think they're removed from the people. As Mick said, like in the European elections, in some countries, less than 30% of people voted in about 7 countries. So that's not representative. People are turned off. And yet they've assumed this power. And in very few countries, the national leadership have stood up to that European mainstream. Very, very few. And when they have, they've been demonized and, called names and, oh, we hate Orban or whatever, or we hate Fico, oh, they're terrible. But then we ignore people in Bulgaria who are robbing the people of Bulgaria because they play the game and say the right things for Europe. So it's a very difficult question to answer, but I think it's in part a hijacking by lobbyists at European level and a sort of a silent coup to take power away from national member states, to acclimatize national leaders into working in this bubble the way they do with army personnel. We've a joint military command. We're all together. We meet for dinner. Our wives and our husbands know each other, and it's all very friendly. We're all on the one team. And suddenly they forget actually that their real team is at home in their member states, that they're playing for Europe, which is different, you know?
Yeah, and Claire mentioned the fact that there was over 60,000 lobbyists registered in Brussels alone. I mean, that's a shocking figure. There were 705 MEPs, 705, and 60,000 lobbyists, right? And you know what? If they weren't being successful, they'd get laid off fairly quick. So they must be doing okay and having an impact. But let me assure you that in my 5 years in the Parliament, there was no lobbyist ever came into my office. Don't really understand why, but I didn't see anybody. But in terms of representation and what's happened to the leadership and all, right? I suppose Britain is a wonderful example. You almost had Starmer being elected in 2017. But for Corbyn, elected in 2017. And it was his own party more than anything else that stopped him. But the media woke up, and by God, they weren't going to let this happen again. And they'd done a job on Corbyn to make sure that under no circumstances did he get a chance to get into power and create what he promised would be a fair society, a just society in Britain. So instead now we have the so-called Labour Party led by Keir Starmer. Keir Starmer. I tell you what, I actually find, people might find this strange, right? But I find him not only more right-wing than Tony Blair, who was a war criminal and a neoliberal, but you know what? Now he give Thatcher a good run for her money. This guy is dangerous. This guy has no principles. This guy said it was okay for Israel to cut off the water and food and electricity to Gaza. That's what he said. And this guy is the leader of the so-called Labour Party in Britain. So how did he get there? How did he manage to win that election? Well, you know what? The mainstream media played a huge role. And then we're going back to another question. How has the mainstream media become so complicit in the imperialist agenda, in the interest of U.S. empire? Well, people should know that the Americans have invested hugely in having a management role of media all across Europe. They're investing hugely in our universities. These guys are up to no good. We had the National Endowment for Democracy boasting that they were spending 200 million a year promoting independent media in Europe. Independent media? They were buying the control of the narrative. That's what they were doing. And we had USA spending 40 billion a year up to all kinds of things, and we couldn't even find out where they were spending it all. But it was up to no good as well. Apart from funding NGOs in places like Georgia, designed to destabilize the place to make sure that they came into the Western camp rather than dare have a good relationship with Russia. But these organizations, like National Endowment for Democracy and USAID, have eroded dramatically our system in Europe. They've done serious damage. And sad to say it, I have to admit, they've been pretty successful, and that's pretty sad.
I mean, Mick mentioned Margaret Thatcher, and I think that's a really good example because Thatcher and Reagan, who were actually Zionists and who were incredibly conservative and no friends of workers or ordinary people, both of them imposed arms embargoes on Israel for years, more than a decade,
In 86.
to the Lebanon war.
Yeah.
Atrocities, undoubtedly, but far less serious than anything we're seeing now. And Thatcher was quoted as saying, well, international law has to apply to all, and they refused to sell them arms. Look how far we've come when someone like that does that, and that was considered normal at that time. And Social Democrats and Greens and Labour Party Liberals are the ones enabling a genocide. So what we have as a process, to me, it's a breakdown of capitalism. It's the end of this crisis in America and in Western capitalism. We didn't touch the part of the world where the majority of the world's peoples live, where a new dawn is breaking, if you like, where we have an alliance outside of empire and the old colonial countries of Europe, where the majority of people in the world live. And we in Ireland certainly hear a lot more of our news about America and Australia and blah, 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 when actually it's the other countries that are dominant and have most of the young people on the planet. And I think it's those people who are struggling to be the leadership of a new alternative. And what we see in Europe is the degeneration of an old empire that is long past its sell-by date and can't even put up a good show. They're like a sort of a gangrene-infested lord or something of an old castle, I don't know.
Yeah, and I mean, you very rarely would have heard the Western media highlight the fact that the countries containing 80% of the world's population did not support the sanctions against Russia. They did not support. They said, no, we're staying neutral. We're not taking part in it. And they were being bullied by the Americans. They were being bullied by the Europeans. But the countries with over 80% of the world's people said, no, we're not going to that space. Things are changing. And unfortunately, those who have given their commitment to the NATO project in Ukraine, oblivious to the amount of working class Ukrainians and Russians dying in the war, fueling the war, making sure it doesn't stop. But these countries, these are the old colonialists of Europe. And we have the Americans. And then we have the likes of Canada, Australia, New Zealand. These were all built on genocides themselves. America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, they were built on genocides. And the Brits and the likes of the French in Europe, right, they made their money from carrying out genocidal activity across the world. So it'll wonder that they haven't fucking moved a whole lot.
It's a fascinating point about Thatcher, that even the hawks of the past would now be too soft for politics today, it seems. One also is reminded of the 90s too. You had all these anti-Russian hawks within the US government who still went out and were quite vocal that expanding NATO would be way too provocative and too aggressive. Today, even suggesting NATO could possibly have anything to do with stoking fears in Russia is just blanket condemned as some vile Kremlin propaganda. Is this historical amnesia? It is fascinating to see the world, understand the world we live in now.
And it's pervasive everywhere. And I think everybody is grappling with the same questions that we're grappling with here. And that's why you have the alienation from politics that we see now.
Well, thank you both for your time. I know you guys are very busy, so thanks again for letting me pick your brain.
Oh, it's lovely to talk to you, Glenn. Thanks so much and keep up the good work. And hopefully we'll see you in Norway in September.
Well, yes, definitely. We'll see you later.
Great stuff. See you then.
Hey, come here, listen. Tell them that they need to drop the price of the beer. It's making them fairly expensive there.
See you later. Thanks, Glenn. Ciao, ciao, Slán.